Near mint condition, the home of collected editions.
That cover's so awesome.
Absolute format is the best way to own this store. Time to empty those wallets and fill those shelves. How's it going, all you minties? Uncanny Omar here from Near Mint Condition, the home of collected editions. And join me today for my overview of the Absolute Preacher from DC Comics. This is the latest printing, and I'll also be comparing it to the original printing. So, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so what we're looking at today is the latest printing of Absolute Preacher Volume 1. There's a total of 3 of these. And I've talked about Preacher on my channel before. I've talked about how it's one of my favorite Vertigo titles. These are some of my favorite Absolute editions. And Volumes 2 and 3 went out of print a couple of years ago. And Volume 1 stayed in print for a little bit, but then it did go out of print. And now it's back in print with a Volume 2 coming out later this year. So that's good news for the people that have been wanting this particular story in Absolute format, which we'll be looking at here in a little bit, just as I flip it around here. Now, the book has been released in, of course, single issues, and then it was released in trade paperbacks, and then in fat trades, and then in deluxe edition, so those hardcovers, and then in Absolute edition, and then 2 omnis. So it's available in many different formats. And that's not even counting the digital format, but this is the home of collected editions. Absolute Preacher, Garth Ennis, Steve Dillon, Volume 1, the DC logo. Now, the Absolute Edition does come wrapped in plastic, and you have the little leaflet right here telling you a little bit about Preacher. So, the other reason why it comes in plastic is because this is definitely a mature content type of book. Even if you've seen the TV show is a little not as bad as this. I will say that. It's a little too TV friendly at some points. But what I'm going to be doing is opening this up here in a little bit and comparing it to my original printing. This one was released in 2016. And the biggest differences I could tell is the Vertigo logo is now the DC logo. So this is part of the Black Label line. And we'll open them up here in a little bit so you can see the differences. Here's another wonderful, by the way, the covers are done by the phenomenal Glenn Fabry. This being one of the most iconic moments, heartbreaking, horrible thing that happens in the book. And this being one of the characters, Cassidy. But just to kind of do a little comparison, here's really no difference. The colors maybe a little bit darker in the new printing, but really no difference here. Now, they're using the DC logo for the DC Black Label line. I've noticed that. Although sometimes they use DC Black Label, like in the case of Absolute Swamp Thing. But that's about the only difference there, and then, of course, on the book. Now, let's get the books out of their slip cases. Both of these look identical, honestly. Even where the gold foil is being chipped on the letters. Looks identical. We'll take a closer look at the book here in a second. The spine, where you had the Vertigo spine, and there's the DC Black Label logo, or just DC logo. Now here will be the difference to the emboss Vertigo label right there, and this one here has the emboss DC Black Label line. Now, Black Label can stand for a lot of things. I've come to just find out. Not just mature content, not just out of continuity. Sometimes it's just the type of story. If it's an original graphic novel, there's some Tom King books that are referred to as Black Label, which I don't understand because it's neither mature nor out of continuity. But anyway, that's for another episode. All right, I'm going to crack open the book here in a little bit, but first I wanted to show just what we're looking at here, why it's one of my favorites. So it's got this faux leather look to it, and the gold foil there with the pattern, Absolute Preacher, Garth Ennis, Steve Dillon, the Roman numeral 1, the pattern, and then the DC logo down here. And yes, this is purposely done to mimic a coffee table, big, expensive Bible. I mean, there's no way they did not do this on purpose. So even before I open the book up, I do want to state, the book is gratuitous, it's offensive, it's controversial, it's blasphemous. So, and then definitely a lot of mature content in here, not just with violence, but vulgarity and sexual content. And oh my gosh, it's Garth Ennis. And of course, everybody's different. Some of my viewers can't stomach anything like this. So, yeah, respect that. And this book is not for you. But I am going to be opening up some of the pages here and talking a little bit about the stories of any of that stuff, you can't stomach, then yeah, check out many of my other videos that I've done on the channel. But that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is Preacher. Okay, let's go ahead and get this new printing opened. We have some black end sheets right there. I love this weathered look to the paper. Like, it's in glossy paper. I would have loved to have seen like a thick matte paper stock used for this book, but this is what they were using. The original one was printed in 2016, and this one here was printed in 2023. So you get your table of contents right here, your introduction, and then you get the title of each of the issues and when the issue was printed. So the series ran all the way from 1995 to 2000. And in this particular book, you're going to find the first 26 issues. Plus a couple of other things like pinups and stuff, which we'll look at in a little bit. Here's your introduction by Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg, who were the two showrunners for Preacher, and that's why they did that introduction. All right, let's go ahead and open it up with issue number 1. I'm going to be talking about the plot to the first story arc that introduces us to pretty much our characters and what their mission is, if you will. And then I'll talk a little more about the stories that you'll find later on, and just being as vague as possible because I want people to experience this if they're interested in the pitch. All right, so we meet these 3 people right here at the diner. This right here is Jesse Custer, who is the titular character. Sorry, gotta go back to issue number 1 right here to cover. This guy right here, covers all done by Glenn Fabry, by the way, in the inside of the book, all in this particular book. All drawn by the phenomenal and legendary and gone way too soon Steve Dillon. So Jesse Custer's there with Tulip O'Hare, this young lady, this blonde girl, and this gentleman with the sunglasses named Cassidy. And the 3 of them are talking about finding God. And Tulip's like, well, some people say, you can find God in church, or some people will say you can find God at the bottom of a bottle. And being that he is a preacher, Jesse, he says, well, I guess I'll start looking at a bar. So that's where that vague introduction starts, and then we get a little bit of a flashback where we see Jesse Custer, who is this town's preacher. So he is the preacher for this particular town in Texas. It's a small little town called Anvil that nobody really has heard of, nobody goes to and tours, but he's just fed up with the people at church. So he snaps. He starts going into the bar and has had his share of many times inside of this bar. But here he starts talking about people's sins, right? He starts saying, look at you all. You come to church on Sunday, maybe, and that's it. Yet you're living in sin throughout the week. So he starts calling them all out, pointing out each of their sins and what they do. Pointing out this gentleman here that's kind of living off of the grants illegally, and the things that happen in his barn, and these 2 horrible people. So, I mean, there's all kinds of horrible people in this book. So, yes, be forewarned. I talked about things like sexual content, violence, and language. But I mean, there's also things in here like rape and incest and animal torture. So if that kind of stuff bothers you, this is definitely not for you. And the biggest thing I think that most people say when talking about this book, this is one of the most blasphemous comics. And yes, that's a bit of an understatement. Because then from here, we get another flashback, but this time taking place in heaven, where a group of angels are sitting around. There's a decapitated angel that comes in. His brother's holding him, and he's like, look, we got to find this Genesis. You all said you had him locked up, and now it's free, and it's going to bond with a human being. We're going to find him. And they're talking about how God's just left. Like, God has left his throne in heaven, and they don't know where he is, and they're put in charge, so they got to go and find this Genesis. And I'll talk a little bit about Genesis here in a second. So we keep going back and forth. They go back to this little diner where the 3 are talking about how their stories came together. So Tulip, as you find out, is an assassin or a hired gun, and she misses her target and runs away, right? Like she misses her target, blowing up the jaw of the bodyguard of the guy that she was supposed to kill, and she runs into Cassidy, who's just sitting there in his truck, and she's like, "Get out of the truck," and he's like, "Nah, get in the truck." So they end up finding her and shooting Cassidy in the head, and he lives. What the heck? And takes off driving. Now, the reader doesn't know something about Cassidy, but it will all be explained here in a little bit. And if you saw the absolute cover, you probably know where this is going. Now, one of the tasks of one of the angels is to go and awaken the Saint of Killers. So the Saint of Killers is this being that has been asleep. He is wielding two guns and looks like he just stepped out of a Western, like Unforgiven. And I don't know why I always go with that character from Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood's character, when I think of this character. But he's a complete badass, and he himself has a backstory, which I will not get into, because that's a bit of a spoiler. And that happens later on, too. So we go back to the three of them sitting at the restaurant, and Jesse starts telling them about, okay, so that Sunday after I got my ass handed to me, I'm back at church preaching, and all of a sudden this big ball of light just comes in and kills the entire church, blows it up, and it goes inside of me. And I don't know what it is. Now, pure coincidence that Tulip and Cassidy were driving past this when they saw the explosion. He is under tarps, and you'll find out why here in a little bit. And she's like, what is this? So she goes and tries to find anybody that's surviving. She doesn't know why this church exploded, and who she finds is Jesse Custer, her ex-boyfriend. Again, all of this being pure coincidence. You find out that they used to date 5 years ago. Now we go back to the three of them sitting at the restaurant, and Jesse walks out, and he's greeted by this cowboy. Now when I first read this, I thought it was the Saint of Killers, but no, it's just somebody that he calls the Duke, and oh my gosh, I'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. Then you get to meet some more characters that will play a bigger part later on. Like this is Sheriff Hugo, who is a piece of garbage. He's racist and conspiracy theorist and just a straight up horrible person. Like I said, there's horrible people that do horrible things in this book. So what this thing that went inside of Jesse is called the Word of God. And whenever he uses it, this power, you'll see the font change to red on white. And what his powers and abilities are is that he's able to tell anyone anything he wants, and they'll do it. So if he tells Cassidy to stand on his head, Cassidy will stand on his head. He tells these cops that come after them to drop their guns, they drop their guns. People listen to him. So it's a power that is just given to him, and he really doesn't know what to do with it. Then we see the Saint of Killers show up and just take down all the cops, because his task is to go after Genesis, who is now inside of Jesse. And as you find out, Genesis is it's the offspring of this demon and this angel. And the angels kept it for a long time, and then it just broke loose, and it went inside of Jesse, and now it is bonded to Jesse, giving him that power. So remember when I said that God had left heaven? They think that's part of the reason why he left, was because of this offspring, this Genesis. There's Arseface, who is another character that plays a big part in this book. And he has a horrible backstory. Now that is Sheriff Hugo's son. So the Duke is somebody that Jesse sees from time to time. And it's really interesting to see the dynamic between the two characters, because, yeah, you know, as you're reading this, you'll see flashbacks of him as a kid, and they're horrific flashbacks. His family, oh my gosh, those people that his grandmother has to be the world's worst grandmother, and Jody and TC, oh my gosh, just awful people. But it was like he created this persona because he used to watch a lot of John Wayne movies when he was a kid to kind of protect him and keep him alive. But then they started interacting a little more, and you don't know what's real and what is. All right, so let's talk about Cassidy because we're still in the first story arc. So when they get into a bar fight, like these two do, often do in the book, it is revealed that Cassidy can't be killed and likes to travel at nighttime because he's a vampire. Now, Cassidy himself has a backstory, and, there's people that hate the character, that love the character, and I'm kind of in the, oh man, he is flawed as hell, but you can't help but like him. There's a lot of things that he does that will make you mad throughout the series. A lot of decisions that he makes. But, oh my gosh, he's just such a great character. Like, his backup story is so amazing. And as you find out, Tulip and Jesse used to date. She's wondering why he ran out on the relationship 5 years ago. Now he has reasons, and the reasons are talked about in a series of flashbacks. There's also other characters that show up through here, but let's talk a little bit about Arseface and the ending of the first arc, and then I'll flip through a little bit of the first volume to kind of give you an idea of what's to come without going into deep spoilers. But Arseface is a kid. He's Sheriff Hugo's son that tried to commit suicide because his favorite musician, Kurt Cobain, did it. And he failed. And that's why he looks like that, and that's why he got the name Arseface. The Saint of Killer has an amazing backup story. Like, his miniseries is so heartbreaking, and why he is the way that he is, why everybody fears him, and what is his goal. And then, when you get to the end, you'll see his final goal. But the first story arc ends when Jesse finds out that God has left heaven. And his mission is to go and find God. So it's not just him, but Cassidy and Tulip join him on this road trip, if you will. And that's when you get to meet other characters in the next chapters, like the serial killer, the meat guy, and you probably know who I'm talking about if you've read the series. The flashbacks with his mom and his dad, oh my gosh, his horrible family, just absolutely horrible people. And that's the character Jesus there. And, this just goes everywhere. There's a whole cult called the Grail that is trying to keep pretty much the line of Jesus pure, and Hairstar is the kind of the military leader that is put in charge of it, but he answers to somebody. And the characters in the stories just get crazier and crazier. Now, I've heard people talk about Preacher, and everybody says the same thing about it, right? It's dark, it's funny, it's got a lot of blasphemous stuff in here, it's edgy, it's controversial. But I don't hear enough people talk about the one thing that I think this story has that is pretty much encompasses what I love about this. And that is, it's a love story. I think it's a beautiful love story between Jesse, and not to spoil this, but you'll see it from the beginning, and Tulip. Yes, it's definitely a southern horror fairy tale. Absolutely, I see that. And it's everything that everybody else says. But I think the one thing people miss, or maybe they just don't see it or don't get it, is this beautiful love story between Jesse and Tulip. Like, there's a wonderful line that happens when both, I'm not going to say the circumstances because that's a little bit of a spoiler, but, she's asking him, do you love me? And he was like, until the end of the world. And oh my gosh, that line just hits. And the final freaking part of the last issue, man, that still hits. I love that part. That is, to me, the perfect ending of a comic book. So there's a total of 3 of these that have been previously released, and Volume 2 comes out later this year, and there's going to be a Volume 3, I assume, next year. But let's look at the extras. Because the extras are really interesting because they never do this in Absolute editions, and that is collect some of the letter pages. I love that the letter pages are collected back here. And not every single one of them, but you can definitely tell where people, where they were when this book came out, how they felt about it, because some of them don't shy away. I remember I was working at a comic book store when this book came out, and I remember a couple of the people coming in and returning the book, and I respect that. Like, that's their faith, and that was the big thing. Like, they were like, I can't read this, my faith won't allow me to read this, or it's just too blasphemous. I did not expect this. I was a big fan of like things like Hellblazer, but this is just way too out there for me, and I get it. And I remember one guy in particular saying that he was a man of God, and then he kind of read this and then fell out of the church because of this book. So I understand and respect everybody's faith, and everybody's faith and connection is different. But in the letter pages, you're going to see some angry people, and then some people that love it, and some people that are like, I needed this. It's everywhere, right? And it's definitely a book that was controversial. We're talking 1995 Vertigo, and at at the top of the game was always X-Men, and then of course we had Superman and Batman, and then comes along a book like Preacher, and I just remember how big of an impact it had at the small comic book store that I worked at. We have Glenn Fabry doing some pinups back here. There is a pinup by Steve Dillon. Matt Hollingworth, by the way, supplying the colors throughout the series. I didn't even talk about that. I talked about the stories, but Steve Dillon's art, I'll go back to that here in a second. And here's some more pinups. And it's interesting because some of the pinups come from issue number 50, which is not collected in here. There's Ars facing his horrible father. That's the Jim Lee pinup right there. Yeah, you can always tell Lee's faces and Williams' inks. That's got to be Amanda Conner. Had to skip a couple of the pinups. This is one from issue 66. There's also the script. I forgot to say that. There's a script in here to issue number 11. I love looking at this stuff. There's coffee stains attached to the scripts. Like, this is an actual script that Garth Ennis sent in. And then the biographies back here. 736 pages. Let's look at the binding. So it is sewn binding, and I remember my first Absolute edition, my first printing of this, had one of the best eyes I'd seen on an Absolute. Because Absolutes at that time, in 2016, were hit and miss. Some of them, weren't built that well. But that one, this one here, which I'll do a comparison here in a minute, it was great. So it's nice to see a big eye. The ribbon is back. And I think Steve Dillon's artwork really benefits from this. I've seen people comment on how, they don't feel like upgrading their trades or the deluxe editions because they don't feel like Steve Dillon is a guy that deserves to have an Absolute style book. But there's so much detail, especially towards the first part of the story, like this book right here. And then, that might be because he was meeting deadlines later on and had to get stories out. But there's just so much details and the facial expressions and the backgrounds that I really appreciate this right here being as close to the actual pages that they draw. But, and also to me, an Absolute edition, to own it, has to be like one of my favorite stories. And this absolutely is one of my favorite stories. All right, what I'm going to do now. All right, let's go ahead and open up the original printing here. And the new printing. So we have 2 end sheets. Same color. Absolute Preacher. And volume 1. I will say the paper stock in the original printing is just a little bit thicker than the new printing. Not by much, just a little bit. I don't think people will even notice. But what I wanted to see, there's your table of contents, the same introduction. And yeah, the colors. Sometimes that's affected by the type of paper, and colors seem to be a little bit darker in the new printing than the original printing. Just a little bit, not by much. I don't think very many people could probably even tell the difference. There we go. And I wanted to see how the book laid over in the original printing compared to the new printing. And honestly, yeah, lays over really well compared to the original printing too. Let's see the way it lays over towards the middle here. About the same. And towards the back. So really not that big of a difference outside of the minor color changes and the thickness of the paper. But I mean, this is still thick. Both of them retail for $150. Both of them have 736 pages. But that, as they say, is that. If you're interested in purchasing this Absolute, don't forget to check out our sponsors.
If you're in Europe and you're interested in buying these books, definitely check out Walt's Comic Shop in Berlin, Germany. They have the cheapest pre-order prices, flat shipping rate of €12 for all EU countries, emails answered within 24 hours, waltscomicshop.com, and you can use the code nearmintcon at checkout and get free shipping for all EU countries with your first order over €40. That's Walt's Comic Shop, your reliable source for omnis and premium collected editions in Europe. Ding!
cheapgraphicnovels.com, your online home for graphic novels and collected editions up to 50% off cover price. They have excellent shipping and prompt and helpful service. Check out their bargain deals for up to 90% off cover price. And don't forget that CGN also takes pre-orders. That way you don't miss out on the hottest releases. And they are currently running a special promotion for you Minties. If you're a first-time customer, after receiving your order confirmation email, reply back to that email and let them know Near Mint Condition sent you their way. They will then apply a free shipping promotional credit to your next order in the US. Cheap Graphic Novels, your source for the hottest books with the kind of deep discount, quality shipping, and customer service that will keep you coming back for more. And that was the content, the page count, and build of this slipcase. Let me know in the comments down below if you've ever read Preacher, if you've never read it and you are going into the character completely blind, or if you've just watched the TV show and you want to see what the big differences are. I can tell you there are a lot of differences, and I prefer the comic more. But that's it, everybody. Don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe, and ring that bell for notifications. Lets you know when our videos are going live. We're also on Spreadshop and Patreon. Amazing ways to support the channel if you can do so. Everyone stay healthy and safe out there. Much love.